Zettel by Ludwig Wittgenstein. Quotes. Zettel by Ludwig Wittgenstein offers an intricate collection of notes that illuminate the complexities of human thought, language, and understanding. Through brief, yet profound observations, Wittgenstein explores how language functions not merely as a vehicle for conveying ideas, but as a framework that structures our experiences. The book invites readers to consider the multifaceted nature of thought and the often overlooked nuances in everyday linguistic expressions, making it a thought-provoking addition to his body of work. Quote 1. The thought is already complete at the beginning of the sentence. How can one know that? This quote reflects on the nature of intention in communication. Wittgenstein questions how we can claim that a thought is fully formed even before the speaker begins to articulate it. The idea seems to challenge the assumption that thinking and speaking are sequential, instead proposing that we may already know what we intend to say without yet having verbalized it. This highlights the complexity of language and thought, and how intertwined they are in human cognition. Quote 2. I'm not just saying this, I mean something by it. Wittgenstein emphasizes that language is not just a series of sounds or phrases, but is imbued with meaning through intention. The statement implies that communication is a deliberate act where meaning must be attached to the words used, rather than them being random utterances. The essence of this quote suggests that meaning is a crucial part of language and is shaped by the speaker's intent, and not just the words themselves. Quote 3. The question, "What do I mean by that?" is one of the most misleading of expressions. Here, Wittgenstein points out that the question of meaning can often be confusing or deceptive. He implies that overanalyzing the intention behind every word or statement might lead us into unnecessary complexities. In most cases, he argues, there might not be any deep, hidden meaning beyond what is plainly stated. This reflects his broader philosophy, that meaning often lies in the use of language within ordinary contexts, rather than in abstract introspection. Quote 4. Say a BCD and mean the weather is fine. This quote highlights Wittgenstein's exploration of the arbitrary nature of language and meaning. He uses an example where random sounds, if agreed upon by a community, could convey a specific meaning, such as a weather description. The point is that meaning in language is not inherent in the sounds themselves, but arises from collective agreement and usage. Language is a tool shaped by context and shared understanding, not by any fixed or natural connection between words and their meanings. Quote 5. Can one order someone to understand a sentence? Wittgenstein questions whether understanding can be forced or commanded, suggesting that understanding is not a mechanical process that can be switched on by simple instruction. The implication is that comprehension involves deeper engagement and cannot be achieved through mere direction. This reinforces the idea that understanding is an active and internal process, linked to context, knowledge, and experience, rather than simply following commands. Quote 6. I was alluding to him when I spoke of a man who... This quote deals with the concept of allusion and indirect reference in language. Wittgenstein shows that communication is often layered and involves more than just the explicit meaning of words. By alluding to someone, the speaker implies something without stating it directly, relying on the listener to catch the hint. It illustrates how much of human communication depends on shared knowledge and subtle cues beyond the surface level of language. Quote 7. Reality is not a property still missing in what is expected, and which accedes to it when one's expectation comes about. Wittgenstein explores the relationship between expectation and reality, suggesting that reality is not an add-on that completes a prior expectation. Instead, reality is a separate phenomenon that does not rely on the anticipation of events to exist. This challenges the notion that expectations are part of reality until they are fulfilled, and instead portrays reality as something entirely independent of human expectations or mental projections. Quote 8. I can imagine a stag that is not there in this meadow, but not kill one that is not there. This quote reflects on the distinction between imagining and acting. Wittgenstein shows that while one can mentally conceive of things that do not exist, physical actions like killing must be tied to reality. This highlights a fundamental difference between thought and action, where thoughts can be detached from reality, but actions require interaction with the physical world. Quote 9. Is I hope a description of a state of mind? A state of mind has duration. So, I have been hoping for the whole day is such a description. But suppose I say to someone, I hope you come. What if he asks me, for how long have you been hoping that? Is the answer, for as long as I've been saying so? This quote explores the relationship between language and internal states. Wittgenstein questions whether expressing hope is truly a reflection of a continuous state of mind or simply a momentary expression. The example illustrates that while hope might seem like a prolonged feeling, its verbal expression is tied to specific moments rather than a consistent, measurable duration. Quote 10. But the difference between knowing and hearing surely doesn't reside simply in such a characteristic as the kind of duration they have. They are surely wholly and utterly distinct. Wittgenstein reflects on the nature of knowledge and perception, suggesting that simply comparing the duration of a state like hearing to knowing doesn't capture the full distinction between them. These are fundamentally different phenomena, not defined by the same measurable traits, such as time, but by their inherent qualitative differences. Quote 11. Pain is a state of consciousness. Understanding is not. Well, the thing is, I don't feel my understanding. This quote juxtaposes pain, which is an experiential state, with understanding, which is more abstract. Wittgenstein points out that while pain is a clearly felt bodily experience, understanding is not something we feel in the same way. It highlights the difference between states of consciousness that are tangible and those that are more cognitive and invisible. Quote 12. Nothing need have gone on in you, and yet you would be remarkable if on such occasions you never had anything to report about what went on in you. Wittgenstein addresses how sometimes we may act, like raising a hand to answer a question, without consciously rehearsing our thoughts, yet it would be odd to claim nothing occurred internally during the process. It reflects on the mysterious interplay between conscious thought and action, emphasizing how actions often happen without clear introspection. Quote 13. A poet's words can pierce us, and that is, of course, intimately connected with the use that they have in our life. This quote acknowledges the power of poetry and language, noting how the emotional impact of a poet's words stems from their relevance and role in our lived experiences. Wittgenstein highlights that language derives much of its meaning and emotional force from how deeply it is intertwined with personal and collective human contexts. Quote 14. For how can it be explained what expressive playing is? Certainly not by anything that accompanies the playing. What is needed for the explanation? One might say, a culture. Wittgenstein points out that certain forms of understanding, such as interpreting musical expressiveness, are not directly explainable through simple descriptions of accompanying physical actions or sensations. Instead, these forms of expression are deeply rooted in cultural context, where shared experiences and norms allow individuals to grasp subtleties like expressiveness. Quote 15. The understanding of music is neither sensation nor a sum of sensations. Nevertheless, it is correct to call it an experience inasmuch as this concept of understanding has some kinship with other concepts of experience. This quote emphasizes that while understanding music is not a simple sensory experience, it can still be considered an experience due to its overlap with other experiential concepts. Wittgenstein acknowledges the complexity of understanding music, which involves more than just auditory perception, but is linked to deeper, often ineffable forms of comprehension. Quote 16. We might say, in all cases what one means by thought is what is alive in the sentence. that without which it is dead, a mere sequence of sounds or written shapes. Here, Wittgenstein discusses how thought is what brings language to life. Without the underlying thought or intention, words become empty, devoid of meaning. This idea reinforces the notion that language, at its core, is not just about the structure of words, but about the meaning and thought they carry. Quote 17. In this case, one might say, only in the system has the sign any life. Wittgenstein emphasizes that the meaning or value of a sign, such as a word or symbol, only exists within the system it is part of, whether that's language, mathematics, or any other structured system. Outside of that system, the sign is meaningless. This highlights the relational nature of meaning and how it is constructed by the rules of the system. Quote 18. How do I know that someone is enchanted? How does one learn the linguistic expression of enchantment? What does it connect up with? With the expression of bodily sensations? This quote raises the question of how we learn and understand the expression of internal states like enchantment. Wittgenstein questions whether such expressions are rooted in physical sensations or if they are tied to something more abstract, like cultural or linguistic conventions. The implication is that understanding someone's emotional state involves more than just observing physical reactions. It also involves interpreting linguistic cues and societal norms. Quote 19. A poem makes an impression on us as we read it. Do you feel the same while you read it as when you read something indifferent? How have I learnt to answer this question? Wittgenstein reflects on the subjective nature of emotional responses to literature. He illustrates that the experience of reading a poem is qualitatively different from reading something indifferent. And this difference is something we learn to express through language. This raises the issue of how deeply personal experiences are shaped by language and shared cultural understanding. Quote 20. Understanding a musical phrase may also be called understanding a language. This quote draws a parallel between understanding music and understanding language, suggesting that musical comprehension operates on similar principles to linguistic interpretation. Just as we grasp meaning in spoken or written words, we also understand the meaning of musical expressions through learned structures such as rhythm, tone, and harmony. Quote 21. Only in the stream of thought and life do words have meaning. Wittgenstein emphasizes that words gain their meaning through their use in real-life situations. Isolated words or phrases might not carry much significance until they are embedded within the context of human experiences, conversations, and thought processes. Language is dynamic, and meaning is constantly shaped by interaction. Quote 22. Doesn't the theme point to anything outside itself? Yes, it does, but that means it makes an impression on me which is connected with things in its surroundings. Wittgenstein acknowledges that certain themes or ideas in art or language resonate with us because they are connected to broader contexts, like cultural or linguistic frameworks. The impression a theme leaves is not self-contained. It gains significance from its relation to other concepts, experiences, or familiar references. Quote 23. When we interpret, we step from one level of thought to another. This statement highlights that interpretation is an active process that involves moving beyond the surface level of an idea or image. Each interpretation takes us deeper into understanding, layering meanings and thoughts over one another. This process of interpreting is part of how we construct and navigate meaning in both language and thought. Quote 24. Consciousness is as clear in his face and behavior as in myself. Wittgenstein suggests that we can perceive consciousness in another person's face and actions just as clearly as we experience it within ourselves. This reflects the idea that human emotions and states of mind are not hidden but are often visible in the expressions and behavior of others, making them recognizable and relatable to our own internal experiences. Quote 25. We do not see the human eye as a receiver. It appears not to let anything in, but to send something out. Here, Wittgenstein points out the unique nature of the human eye, which we perceive as outwardly expressive rather than merely a passive organ that receives light. The metaphor of the eye sending something out suggests that we imbue eyes with emotional significance, such as the ability to convey feelings like anger, joy, or fear through glances and expressions. Quote 26. One says, "How can these gestures, this way of holding the hand, this picture, be the wish that such and such were the case? It is nothing more than a hand over a table, and there it is, alone and without a sense." Wittgenstein illustrates the concept that isolated actions or images, when removed from their context, seem meaningless. The gesture of a hand over a table, for example, holds no inherent meaning unless understood within the context of a broader situation, such as a wish or intention. This highlights his philosophy that meaning in actions or words is not intrinsic, but derived from the context in which they are used. Quote 27. At that moment, the thought was before my mind. I had this picture. So was the picture the thought? No, for if I had just told someone the picture, he would not have got the thought. Wittgenstein explores the difference between thought and the images that sometimes accompany it. Although we might picture something in our mind when thinking, that image alone does not fully convey the thought. If shared with another person without explanation, the image may fail to communicate the same idea. Thus, thoughts often involve more than just mental images. They require articulation through language to be fully understood. Quote 28. Let us imagine a picture story in schematic pictures, and thus more like the narrative in a language than a series of realistic pictures. This quote suggests that abstract representations, like schematic pictures, can function similarly to language. Just as language conveys meaning through symbols and structure, a series of simple images can also tell a coherent story. Wittgenstein uses this example to argue that meaning can be constructed through non-linguistic forms, provided they are understood within a shared system or narrative framework. Quote 29. Sentences serve to describe how things are, we think. The sentence as a picture. Wittgenstein suggests that sentences can be seen as pictures that represent reality. Just as a picture depicts a scene or object, a sentence describes a state of affairs. This analogy emphasizes the representational function of language, where words are tools for depicting the world, not just for direct communication, but also for creating mental images or models of reality. Quote 30. I understand this picture exactly. I could model it in clay. I understand this description exactly. I could make a drawing from it. This quote highlights the relationship between understanding and representation. Wittgenstein suggests that true comprehension of a description or picture is evident when one is capable of translating it into another form, such as a model or drawing. This ability to reproduce or visualize the information underscores the depth of understanding. Quote 31. What does it mean to discover that a sentence does not make sense? Wittgenstein questions the process of realizing that a sentence lacks meaning. He implies that recognizing nonsense in language involves more than just examining the words. It requires understanding their use and application in context. The meaninglessness of a sentence is not always obvious from its structure, but becomes clear when it fails to function meaningfully in a language game or real-life application. Quote 32. I haven't ever in fact seen a black patch gradually getting lighter until it was white, and then the white turning more and more reddish until it was red. But I know that it is possible, because I can imagine it. This quote examines the power of imagination in grasping concepts beyond direct experience. Wittgenstein acknowledges that while some things might not be empirically observed, they can still be understood and accepted as possibilities because we can imagine them. This highlights the role of imagination in expanding our understanding of reality beyond immediate perception. Quote 33. It makes sense to speak of an endless row of trees. I can surely imagine a row of trees going on without end. Wittgenstein reflects on the concept of infinity in language and imagination. He suggests that it makes sense to talk about endlessness, even though we cannot physically experience it. The ability to imagine something continuing indefinitely demonstrates how language and thought allow us to conceptualize abstract ideas like infinity, even though they are beyond our direct experience. Quote 34. Here the temptation is overwhelming to say something further, when everything has already been described. This quote reflects Wittgenstein's observation that, even when a complete description is given, there is often a human urge to explain further. He points to this tendency as misleading, rooted in a false assumption that more explanation is needed when, in fact, the description already serves as the solution. This captures a key theme in his philosophy, that the clarity in language lies in how we use it, not in adding unnecessary explanations. Quote 35. Why do you demand explanations? If they are given you, you will once more be facing a terminus. Wittgenstein challenges the idea of endlessly seeking explanations, suggesting that every explanation has a stopping point. Beyond this, further inquiry becomes futile. He argues that asking for more explanations after reaching this endpoint doesn't advance understanding, but only repeats the same process. This reflects his view that language and understanding have practical limits that are often overlooked. Quote 36. I cannot describe how, in general, to employ rules, except by teaching you, training you to employ rules. Here, Wittgenstein points out that some aspects of knowledge, like using rules, can't simply be described abstractly. Instead, they must be taught through practice and examples. This statement underscores his belief that understanding often comes from active engagement and doing, not just from theoretical descriptions. It also reinforces his concept that meaning and understanding are tied to practical use. Quote 37. Language is not defined for us as an arrangement fulfilling a definite purpose. Wittgenstein reflects on the nature of language, suggesting that it cannot be neatly defined by a single purpose. Instead, language is a complex collection of systems with various uses that may resemble one another. This statement emphasizes the flexibility and diversity of language, implying that its meaning is constructed through different contexts, rather than being confined to a strict functional definition. Quote 38. It is very difficult to describe paths of thought where there are already many lines of thought laid down. This quote highlights the challenge of thinking outside of established frameworks. Wittgenstein explains that when well-worn patterns of thought already exist, it is hard to create new ways of thinking without falling back into the same grooves. This difficulty is important in philosophy, where breaking away from traditional concepts requires significant effort and imagination. Quote 39. The fact that we deal with certain concepts and not with others only shows how various in kind conceptual tools are. Wittgenstein points out that our use of certain concepts and neglect of others is a reflection of how diverse and flexible conceptual tools can be. He emphasizes that concepts are not rigid, but adaptable to the needs of different contexts. This idea supports his broader view that meaning is fluid and shaped by the way we use language and concepts within specific situations. Quote 40. I make a plan not merely so as to make myself understood, but also in order to get clear about the matter myself. This quote captures the dual role of language. It is not only a means of communicating with others, but also a tool for self-understanding. Wittgenstein suggests that the process of articulating thoughts helps clarify and structure them for the speaker as well. Language thus serves as both an external communication method and an internal cognitive tool. Quote 41. We have a color system as we have a number system. Wittgenstein compares the way we categorize colors to the way we structure numbers, indicating that both systems are constructed and maintained by human conventions. This highlights his idea that many of the systems we rely on, whether for colors or numbers, are not grounded in objective reality, but in the practical use that emerges from shared human understanding. Quote 42. Has the verb to dream a present tense? How does a person learn to use this? Wittgenstein questions how we understand and use language to describe abstract experiences like dreaming. The present tense of to dream challenges our grasp of time and consciousness, asking how we learn to apply such concepts to something we often only recognize retrospectively. It prompts us to think about how the language of subjective experiences is acquired and understood, highlighting the complexity of human thought. Quote 43. I have consciousness. This is a statement about which no doubt is possible. Here, Wittgenstein considers the certainty surrounding statements about self-awareness. He argues that asserting one's own consciousness leaves no room for doubt, suggesting that such declarations are beyond verification and exist in a realm of absolute personal certainty. This reflects his broader exploration of language's limitations when it comes to expressing internal, subjective states. Quote 44. Can someone believe that 25x 25 Tartars 625? Wittgenstein examines belief in simple mathematical truths and asks what it means to hold such beliefs. He suggests that certain kinds of knowledge, like basic arithmetic, seem beyond questioning. However, he probes the nature of belief in knowledge, illustrating how belief in mathematical facts functions within a framework of learned conventions. Quote 45. How does it come about that doubt is not subject to arbitrary choice? Wittgenstein explores the nature of doubt, suggesting that doubt cannot simply be willed into existence, but must arise from certain conditions or learning. He implies that doubt is shaped by the knowledge and experiences a person has accumulated, and it functions involuntarily, not as an act of sheer will. This points to the idea that doubt, like belief, is rooted in a structure of understanding. Quote 46. No one but a philosopher would say, I know that I have two hands. But one may well say, I am unable to doubt that I have two hands. Wittgenstein contrasts ordinary certainty with philosophical doubt, suggesting that while everyday life assumes the presence of basic facts, like having two hands, only philosophers question such basic realities. He illustrates that in most cases, it is not about knowing or proving such things, but simply the impossibility of doubting them, emphasizing the difference between practical certainty and philosophical inquiry. Quote 47. You say that is red, but how is it decided if you are right? Doesn't human agreement decide? This quote reflects Wittgenstein's view that meaning in language is determined through shared human practices. He emphasizes that judgments about things like color are grounded in collective agreement, rather than individual perception alone. This underscores his argument that understanding language and reality is a social, not merely personal, enterprise. Quote 48. Any explanation has its foundation in training. Wittgenstein suggests that all forms of explanation are rooted in learned practices. He argues that understanding, whether of concepts or language, comes from prior training and social learning, not from abstract reasoning alone. This reinforces his view that meaning and comprehension arise from practical engagement within a shared system of behaviors. Quote 49. What does it mean to use a word as a designation, a name of a sensation? Isn't there something to investigate here? Wittgenstein asks us to consider how we attach language to our internal experiences, like sensations. He points out that there is more to this than simply naming a feeling, suggesting that such processes involve deeper investigation into how we learn and apply words to subjective states. This highlights his focus on the complexities of how language and experience are intertwined. Quote 50. Is it hair-splitting to say, joy, enjoyment, delight, are not sensations? Wittgenstein questions the nature of emotions such as joy and delight, challenging the assumption that they are sensations. He asks how much they resemble other sensations, like physical pain, suggesting that while they might feel similar in some ways, they are not the same. This distinction opens up a deeper inquiry into how we classify emotions versus physical sensations, which highlights the complexity of emotional experiences. Quote 51. I feel great joy? Where? That sounds like nonsense. This quote reflects Wittgenstein's exploration of emotions and their relationship to the body. He points out that, unlike physical sensations, emotions like joy cannot be precisely localized. The lack of a clear physical location for joy contrasts with how we might describe pain or touch, suggesting that emotions operate differently, more broadly, and often express themselves through behavior or facial expressions rather than being confined to a specific part of the body. Quote 52. But joy surely designates an inward thing. No, joy designates nothing at all, neither any inward nor any outward thing. Wittgenstein challenges the common assumption that emotions like joy are internal states or entities. He suggests that joy doesn't refer to something specific, inside or outside us. Instead, it is a way of describing a set of behaviors and expressions rather than an inner, private experience. This reflects his view that emotions are not hidden feelings, but are expressed through our actions and interactions with the world. Quote 53. The language game, I am afraid, already contains the object. Wittgenstein points out that when we say we are afraid, the phrase itself already implies the presence of an object or situation that we fear. This shows how language not only describes emotions, but also embeds context within its structure. Fear is not an abstract feeling, but is directed towards something, and the structure of our language reflects this relationship. Quote 54. Love is not a feeling. Love is put to the test. Pain not. Wittgenstein distinguishes between love and other experiences, such as physical sensations like pain. He suggests that love is not simply a feeling, but something that manifests through actions and can be tested, unlike pain, which is experienced in the body. This insight points to the complexity of emotions and relationships, where love is shown and proven through actions rather than just being a passive internal state. Quote 55. We use mood concepts to describe sense impressions and images. This quote highlights how language and emotions intersect. Wittgenstein observes that we often use terms related to mood, such as sadness or joy, to describe not just people, but also objects, themes, or landscapes. This reflects the human tendency to project emotional states onto the world around us, blending our internal experiences with external perceptions. Quote 56. If you doubt whether a spider feels pain, it is not because you don't know what to expect. Wittgenstein questions the nature of doubt regarding whether non-human creatures, like spiders, feel pain. He suggests that this doubt isn't about our expectations, but arises from deeper uncertainties about understanding other beings' experiences. This reflects his broader philosophical exploration of how we comprehend the feelings and inner lives of others, whether human or animal. Quote 57. Our language game is an extension of primitive behavior. Wittgenstein emphasizes that the sophisticated use of language is grounded in basic instinctive behaviors. He suggests that our complex ways of communicating about feelings, thoughts, and experiences are extensions of more fundamental, non-verbal actions. This view connects language to our shared human practices, showing how deeply rooted communication is in everyday life. Quote 58. The unpredictability of human behavior. But for this, would one still say that one can never know what is going on in anyone else? Wittgenstein addresses the inherent unpredictability of human actions, suggesting that this unpredictability is closely tied to our inability to fully understand another person's inner experiences. He implies that if human behavior were entirely predictable, our uncertainty about other people's thoughts and emotions would likely diminish. This points to the complex relationship between behavior and the interpretation of mental states, and how mystery arises from unpredictability. Quote 59. But what would it be like if human behavior were not unpredictable? How are we to imagine this? Here, Wittgenstein challenges us to imagine a world where human actions are entirely predictable, questioning what such a world might look like. He prompts us to think about how this would change our interactions and understanding of others. This thought experiment serves to emphasize the importance of uncertainty in human relationships and communication, suggesting that unpredictability is a crucial part of our lived experience. Quote 60. One of the most dangerous of ideas for a philosopher is, oddly enough, that we think with our heads or in our heads. Wittgenstein criticizes the common belief that thinking occurs solely in the brain or the mind. He suggests that this idea is misleading because it reduces the complexity of thought to a purely physical or spatial process. By calling it dangerous, he warns against oversimplifying the nature of thinking, emphasizing that thinking involves more than just a physiological or localized brain function. It is a dynamic activity interconnected with language, behavior, and social interactions. Quote 61. The idea of thinking as a process in the head, in a completely enclosed space, gives him something occult. This quote expands on Wittgenstein's critique of viewing thought as merely a brain activity. He points out that thinking, when conceptualized as an isolated process occurring solely within the head, takes on an almost mystical or supernatural quality. This view, he argues, distorts our understanding of what thinking actually is, an activity that is visible and shared through communication and action, not confined to an invisible inner realm. Quote 62. Writing is certainly a voluntary movement, and yet an automatic one. And of course, there is no question of a feeling of each movement in writing. Wittgenstein explores the nature of writing, highlighting the paradox that it is both voluntary and automatic. He notes that while writing is a deliberate act, we don't consciously feel every single movement our hand makes while doing it. This reflects the idea that some actions, though controlled, happen without our full awareness, illustrating the complexity of voluntary behavior. Quote 63. You give someone a signal when you imagine something. You use different signals for different images. In this quote, Wittgenstein emphasizes that even imagination involves a form of signaling, akin to how we use language to communicate thoughts. When we form images in our mind, we associate different signals or cues with different concepts, illustrating the structured, almost linguistic nature of imagination. This highlights how deeply embedded communication and representation are, even in internal cognitive processes. Quote 64. If someone really were to say, "I don't know whether I am now seeing a tree or having an image of it," I should at first think he meant, or just fancying that there is a tree over there. Wittgenstein reflects on the confusion between perception and imagination, suggesting that if someone were unsure whether they were seeing a tree or merely imagining it, they might be confusing imagination with reality. This underscores the difference between experiencing something directly through the senses and creating an image of it in the mind, emphasizing the need to distinguish between perception and mental imagery. Quote 65. Nothing could be more mistaken than to say, seeing and forming an image are different activities. Wittgenstein challenges the assumption that seeing and imagining are entirely separate activities. He suggests that the two are deeply intertwined, and the difference between them is not as clear-cut as we might think. This points to his broader argument that many of our mental activities are interconnected, and that drawing strict boundaries between them oversimplifies their nature. Quote 66. The important sense of Frege's assertion sign is perhaps best grasped if we say, it signalizes clearly the beginning of the sentence. Wittgenstein reflects on Frege's use of the assertion sign, which marks the beginning of a sentence and signifies the transition into meaningful speech. By focusing on the significance of starting a sentence, he emphasizes the importance of clarity in communication. This quote touches on the role of structure in language, where the assertion sign helps delineate where meaningful communication begins, making it easier to distinguish between mere words and complete thoughts. Quote 67. Contradiction is to be regarded not as a catastrophe, but as a wall indicating that we can't go on here. Wittgenstein presents contradiction not as a disastrous end, but as a natural limit, a boundary that shows where reasoning or discussion must stop. Instead of seeing contradictions as failures, he suggests they reveal where logic or language breaks down, thus helping to clarify the limits of what can be said or understood. This perspective reflects his view that contradictions can be instructive, showing the boundaries of sense and meaning. Quote 68. I should like to ask, not so much, what must we do to avoid a contradiction, as what ought we to do if we have arrived at a contradiction? Wittgenstein shifts the focus from preventing contradictions to dealing with them when they occur. He suggests that instead of fearing or avoiding contradictions, we should consider how to respond to them. This reflects his pragmatic approach to philosophical problems, where encountering a contradiction becomes an opportunity for reflection and learning rather than a sign of failure or error. Quote 69. Our motto might be, "Let us not be bewitched." Wittgenstein warns against being misled by language or ideas, suggesting that we should strive to avoid being bewitched by confusing or misleading expressions. This reflects his broader concern with how easily language can deceive us into thinking we understand something when we do not. By urging caution, he emphasizes the importance of clarity and careful analysis in philosophical thinking. Quote 70. A contradiction prevents me from getting to act in the language game. Here, Wittgenstein connects the idea of contradiction with action, suggesting that encountering a contradiction halts meaningful participation in a language game. In his framework, language games are practical, and contradictions disrupt their function. This idea highlights how logical consistency is necessary for effective communication and action within any system of rules, whether linguistic or otherwise. Quote 71. If memory shows us the past, how does it show us that it is the past? Wittgenstein raises a key question about the nature of memory, questioning how memory can make us aware that what we recall belongs to the past. He challenges the assumption that memory simply shows the past, pointing out the difficulty in understanding how this process works. This reflects his exploration of how we distinguish between present experiences and recollections. Quote 72. It tastes exactly like sugar. How is it I can be so sure of this? Wittgenstein reflects on the certainty we feel when identifying a taste, even when that identification might later prove wrong. He emphasizes the strength of the association between a concept, sugar, and a sensation, taste, noting how easily we trust our judgment in such situations. This underscores his interest in how confidently we rely on memory and sensory experience, even when those judgments may be fallible. Quote 73. One remembers exactly and with certainty what sugar tastes like. I do not say, I believe sugar tastes like this. This quote highlights the role of memory in sensory experience, where the certainty of recall about something as specific as taste is taken for granted. Wittgenstein points out that when we recognize a familiar taste like sugar, we don't express it as a belief, but as a fact, reflecting the strength of memory and perception. It raises questions about how we distinguish between belief and knowledge in everyday experiences. Zettel by Ludwig Wittgenstein leaves readers with a profound understanding of how thought, meaning, and language intertwine in shaping our perception of reality. Wittgenstein illustrates that language is deeply embedded in human practices and that its role extends beyond mere representation, instead constituting a living part of our experiences. His fragmented reflections emphasize the fluidity of meaning and challenge conventional assumptions about the nature of mind and knowledge. Ultimately, Zettel stands as a testament to Wittgenstein's commitment to examining the foundational aspects of language, encouraging readers to reflect critically on the often invisible structures that influence human understanding.
Curious to dive into the mind of Ludwig Wittgenstein? With StudyLab Pro's book GPT, it's possible. Ask questions, explore themes, and discover the depths of Zettel in an entirely new way. Start your conversation now by clicking on our logo. And if you're hungry for more educational content, subscribe to our channel to keep discovering, learning, and growing. Want more than just videos? Click on our logo now to join us on our platform for multiple choice tests, in-depth content, and tools to help you ace your studies. Get started now.